Now, from CBS News Miami, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Welcome to Facing South Florida, and this week Ron DeSantis' State Board of Education passed new standards for how African American history should be taught in Florida classrooms. The state of Florida will now require teachers to explain the benefits of slavery for blacks and how slaves learned various skills while they were slaves that would be useful for them later in their lives. Here is some of the public reaction during a hearing by the Board of Education in Orlando this week.
Any kind of standards that indicate that slavery benefited black people is such an insult. My husband is black, my daughter is black, and the thought that slavery benefited them, how could that be taught? The fact that the pushback to Reconstruction benefited them, the fact that Jim Crow benefited them, how can we teach that to students? How can someone look at a child with a straight face and say that slavery benefited black people?
And please, do not, for the love of God, tell kids that slavery was beneficial, because I can guarantee you it most certainly was not.
And when covering massacres like Rosewood, in which a group of whites went on a rampage in 1923, killing and lynching black men and burning the town to the ground, or the lesser-known Ocoee Massacre of 1920, in which a mob of whites killed more than 30 blacks on Election Day because one of the blacks had tried to vote, Florida teachers will now be required to discuss the violence not only towards blacks during these events, but how blacks were violent as well. Here's what folks had to say about that requirement.
Also, it mentions that the violence, the Ocoee Massacre talks about violence perpetrated by African Americans. So to me, this is complete gaslighting. It's not reality, it's not fact-based.
The intent behind the legislature's passage of 2020's House Bill 1213 was to bring awareness and understanding of the atrocity that was the Ocoee Massacre to Florida's high school students. And yet, with respect to standard SSAA 912 3.6, which is the only standard which references the Ocoee Massacre, it states that instruction includes acts of violence perpetrated against and by African Americans. The new standard suggests that violence by black residents in defense of their lives and homes as they were surrounded by armed mobs and flames, and as they were forced to flee their homes or be shot or burned, are to be included as a seemingly equal part of the standard. This is egregious if you understand what happened to the black residents in Ocoee in 1920 and the long-lasting impacts, including the loss of life and property, trauma, and the denial of generational wealth to their descendants.
Now, when it comes to actually understanding the facts about black history, especially here in Florida, there is no one better than Professor Marvin Dunn. I asked for his reaction to these new standards.
I was outraged. I could not believe that the Board of Education of Florida is trying to justify the enslavement of people by trying to make it making it a mandatory subject in Florida schools to teach that slaves benefited from being enslaved. I think that's evil. To argue that, because we made you a blacksmith while you were enslaved, you learned that skill, therefore you should be grateful. But suppose the person had not been enslaved, he might have been a king or a doctor. So what kind of a rationalization is it that because we taught you something or you learned yourself some skill that's useful later on, that you should be grateful? But that is a very strong feeling in the South among some people, some white people. They should be grateful. We civilized them. We took them out of Africa. We made them more human. We made them Christians. And therefore, slavery itself was a good thing for blacks. That logic has not died in the South, and it has not died in Florida. And it now lives in these standards.
I'll be honest with you, I read through the standards and I'm just baffled by so much of it. I know a lot of attention has been paid to that line that talks about how slavery allowed them to develop certain skills that they could apply later. And then, of course, the other part of that, some outrage, deals with the notion that a lot of these massacres that have taken place around the country, and then here, Ocoee, they have to now teach about the violence to and by African Americans.
But here's what's interesting.
During these things. So you're a historian, set the record straight on that.
Thank you for asking that question about Ocoee. There was no black violence against whites in Ocoee. There were 2 white men killed in Ocoee, but they were killed, according to the sheriff, by friendly fire from whites who surrounded a house and started shooting into it. But the view is that blacks in Ocoee participated in the violence. It's ridiculous. They make the same argument about Rosewood, that it was the equivalent expression of racial violence. You're trapped in your house with a mob outside. They shoot and kill your mother dead. She falls dead on the floor in front of you, and you defend your house and your mother's home. And Florida now wants to teach that that's equivalent racial violence on both sides. It's a devastating standard to impose on the school children of Florida.
What do you think the purpose of it is?
That's a very good question. I think the purpose is to make the past evils of slavery not as bad, to minimize the impact of slavery on blacks. And in that way, maybe in a way, deal with white guilt, whatever they may be, of that left, that's attached to that. It's an attempt to rationalize enslavement by arguing that you civilized the slave. You gave them a benefit by enslaving them. And in certain parts of the South, that's been a very long story.
Well, one of the things that's interesting that hasn't gotten as much attention is one of the aspects that I noted in the high school grades. You know, they talk about, again, this is an African-American history course, and they examine the condition of slavery as it existed in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe prior to 1619. They want instruction on how there were similarities between serfdom and slavery, you know, in Eastern Europe. They want to talk about, you know, in Asia, how there was slavery in Asia. It's almost as if sort of saying America's slavery wasn't that special, wasn't that unique, wasn't that big a deal. You know, it was just basically something, everybody has slaves. So
American slavery was different. American slavery was different. It was the only system of enslavement that made the people property, chattel property, instead of human beings. Every other system of slavery did not do that to the enslaved. Only in America were the enslaved reduced to property. They're trying to make the argument in slavery that slavery existed everywhere. So what was so bad about American slavery? It was particularly evil because it dehumanized the people who were enslaved.
Well, one of the things that I also thought was interesting is for elementary and middle school, there's essentially no discussion of the last 150 years of African-American life. Basically, the only thing that you're shown are, you know, celebrities and athletes. That's the extent of the you know, understanding of African-American history for grade school and middle school students.
Part of my problem with the way Black history has been taught over the generations is to focus on individuals who contributed to American history, which is individual inventors who were Black. That's all important. What's not taught is the context of the history. What was going on with people? What were they doing to people as these individuals were standing out? I think it makes the story of Black people less important when you point to individuals who accomplished certain things, and that's important, but not to tell what was going on. What was going on in their lives in Florida during this period? We don't get that in these new standards. One
of the things that I also can't help but notice in reading through the standards myself is that there are two areas that they want to cover. Early civil rights movement, which they define as 1865 to 1896, and then the modern civil rights era, 1945 to 1968. Basically, Black history ends at 1968. Yes, they will teach that Barack Obama became president, but, you know, in terms of talking about movements, because they talk about, you know, the civil rights era and Martin Luther King and John Lewis and all of that, which is, you know, a history that they no longer can deny, you know, but the notion that there is nothing since then. What about in the 80s? What about a discussion of the, you know, of sentencing laws in terms of disparate treatment for blacks and whites when it came to crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, or into the 90s or the 2000s? no discussion of police brutality or any of the issues that led to the rise of Black Lives Matter. No discussion of that. It's as if the civil rights era was accomplished in 1968, and that's it after that.
Because American history gets very dirty after that. Resistance becomes a part of what's happening in Black America. You have groups rising up and fighting back, the Black Panthers, eventually Black Lives Matter. That part of Black history is ignored in these standards, as if the history of Black resistance itself is minimized in these standards. We don't see Black heroes who fought back, who resisted. Yes, we got King and we got Bethune and others who were fairly passive, obviously, in their approach, but not those who stood up. And after the Civil Rights Movement, that is what Black America moved to: active resistance of segregation and discrimination. And those stories are very uncomfortable to have in a history book, according to the Florida Department of Education.
One of the things, too, is examine organizational approaches to resisting equality in America. What I love is the choice of language, that it's not racism, that it's not oppression, that it's not a systemic effort by institutions to codify racism in law. It's organizational approaches to resisting equality in America. Resisting equality in America. That's what's happened to Blacks here, right?
Exactly. Jim, the word lynching is not even in the standards. Even though a Black person in Florida during the lynching era had a better chance of being lynched than a Black person in Mississippi or than a Black person in Alabama. But these standards don't even mention that kind of violence was perpetrated against Blacks in this country. So it's a whitewash of history. It's a continuation of the DeSantis use of the Board of Education as a political tool. And America needs to take heed of what's happening in Florida. The very fact that they're trying to impose a system of education on our students in Florida in which they rationalize slavery as being a benefit to the enslaved. It's outrageous.
What do you think the long-term effect is on the quality of education that our high school students and grade school students and middle school students will now be receiving in Florida?
Florida students will be receiving a watered-down treatment of American history. Florida students will be disadvantaged by not knowing as much as other students from other states about what happened in our country. I think Florida students will have more difficulty getting along with other races, having been educated in Florida where these kinds of standards have been imposed upon them. This does not bode well for the future generation of Floridians, white or Black, because they're going to be miseducated, misguided, misinformed, and I think at a great disadvantage in the public the spaces that they may occupy in the future. May I make a point about something that struck me in this?
Sure, please go ahead.
They are discussing the increase in slaves, the number of slaves in the country, and they speak of that in terms of natural increase. There was nothing natural about it. Black women were being raped by white men to produce slaves that the slave master therefore would not have to buy. So the idea that Blacks increased their numbers through natural increase is a misstatement and misrepresents the fact that whites used Black women to produce products that they could sell on the slave market. So I thought that use of natural increase was an insult to Black history.
When we come back, I will speak to the Democratic leader of the Florida House about the recent revelations from our investigation into Republican State Representative Fabian Basabe. Stay with us. Welcome back. As you know by now, Republican State Representative Fabian Basabe has been accused of sexually harassing two members of his staff, a charge he vehemently denies, I might add. These allegations, however, have brought a new spotlight on Basabe and his past conduct, including his alleged use of racial epithets and repeated acts of drunken buffoonery. This week, I spoke to the state representative, who is the Democratic leader in the Florida House, Fentress Driscoll.
Well, I'll start with the allegations, Jim, and I'll say that those are shocking and disturbing. When you read in detail, the graphic detail of these allegations, your heart goes out to this legislative aide and to his intern, who's just a college student. And, I started thinking about the power differential between an elected official and a young person who really is just trying to get a start in life or in their career, and part of the allegations that they were required to sign NDAs, which caused confusion over whether or not they could bring these allegations forward. So for me, the main focus is making sure that we have a safe workplace and environment for state employees, and especially for our legislative staff and interns who oftentimes are young people. And like I mentioned, they're just trying to get their start in their career. You know, as for Representative Basabe, what I would say is when you really look over the course of his life and the different allegations that have surfaced against him at various points in time, there seems to be a pattern of evading responsibility. You know, these recent allegations have come to the surface, and I've seen no indication from him that he intends to take responsibility for any of this. If anything, it seems that he's trying to gaslight the public and gaslight his district and try to put the responsibility on his legislative aide, who again is a young person just starting his career. So all of this has been very troubling to me and very disturbing. I'll tell you another thing is that it is absolutely a distraction from the important work that we need to do in the legislature. And it seems that his constituents are not being served to the highest and best ability because of these distractions.
Do you believe Fabian Basabe should resign?
Well, yes, I do think he should resign, but I don't think he actually will, because again, what I've seen over the course of his life is that he doesn't take responsibility for his bad actions. I'll tell you that the community has already started organizing against him, because when Fabian campaigned, he promised to be an ally to the LGBTQ community. And then no sooner than he was elected, did he start aligning himself with Governor DeSantis and voting for Governor DeSantis's anti-LGBTQ agenda. So he's already worn out his welcome with his own community and his constituents down in South Florida, and they want to see him go. And ultimately, they will probably be the ones to decide to vote him out next year on November 5th.
You mentioned earlier the issue of the non-disclosure agreements that he required his staff to sign. He acknowledges that he requires them to sign it now, after initially sort of hedging about whether or not it was him asking them to sign. We now know that it was him, and he acknowledges that. Are you aware of any other legislator who has ever asked, do you ask employees to sign NDAs? And what's the danger of having a public official require their staff who work for the taxpayers to sign non-disclosure agreements? I mean, there's a lot of layers to that, it seems.
Right, and that is absolutely not the standard procedure for hiring state employees and bringing someone into your legislative office that you have them sign an NDA. So I was very surprised when Representative Basabe initially said he just went with whatever was in the hiring package. I can tell you that that's not a part of the hiring package. And so to me, the danger and concern is what we've seen here, right? It caused confusion with these two young men about what their rights were, what their opportunities were to disclose this bad behavior. They were confused by that NDA, and they didn't even know if they could bring these allegations forward. And I'll tell you that it should not take having to bring a lawsuit and going public to have issues of sexual harassment and just general harassment in the workplace addressed. That's not the type of work environment that we want to have in the Florida legislature.
Obviously, a lot of attention is being cast on the allegations that he sexually harassed his staff. But, just as troubling, if not in some ways more troubling to me, are some of the allegations and some of the incidents that have been ascribed to him dealing with race and his views and his language as it relates to African Americans. He admits to using the word Negro in referring to security guards at the Hamptons a number of years ago when he was angry with them. He admits that he used it in a derogatory manner, as if there would be any debate about that, but he admits to referring to them as Negroes. And then in 2019 during Art Basel, he was denied admittance into a party, and there was a woman publicist working the door, an African-American woman, and he allegedly referred to her using the N-word, along with also calling her a peasant, which is apparently a favorite phrase of his to describe people. I realize he denies using the N-word, but your reaction when you hear things like that, in terms of the standard that sets and just your overall reaction?
Right. Well, when there's so much smoke, you start to think that there's probably fire. And again, like I mentioned at the top of our interview, This seems to be a pattern with Representative Basabe of engaging in bad behavior and then denying it and taking no responsibility for it, or then perhaps coming out strongly initially saying, oh, I never did that. And then later on, you get a little bit of backpedaling and backtracking, and the truth starts to come out, and we start to learn and hear that no, he actually does use those words, right? We know that his staffers have come forward and shared information about some of the awful, abhorrent language that Representative Basabe has used to refer to other people, and particularly to African Americans. So it's all very problematic. You know, the other thing is that it's hard to believe Representative Basabe when there's been so much undermining of public trust, right? He won this district by only 242 votes. That's nothing, right? That is a razor thin margin. So he acts as though he has a mandate in this seat, and the reality is that he doesn't. He has betrayed his constituents. He will say one thing and then do another. So it becomes very difficult to even believe that he's telling the truth about these allegations of the usage of racial slurs.
I know the focus is on what Representative Basabe did. That's where my investigation has been, but also looking at the larger picture, which is this goes to a larger question about House leadership to me. You know, the initial investigation into the slapping incident in which Representative Basabe was accused of slapping one of his aides and telling him to stand in a corner in obviously another derisive, condescending way. The Speaker of the House, Paul Renner, hired an outside law firm to investigate the claims. The attorneys for that young man, as well as a second young man, say they told those investigators that there was also claims of sexual harassment, that there were more serious allegations in addition to the slapping incident. And none of that ended up showing up in the report, and there seems to be a question as to whether or not they informed the Speaker's office about these new allegations during the course of the investigation. We've requested all of the records from that have either been sent to the Speaker or by the law firm hired by the Speaker, and so far have not received those records. How important is it from your perspective that those records should be released and that there should be a full accounting of what House Speaker Renner knew and when he knew it?
I think that's very important, and I do hope that you get those records because I want to know. And the way that protocol typically works in the House, I'm the Democratic leader, so I tend to take care of issues involving Democratic members. And then the majority leader and the Speaker tend to take care of issues involving members from the Republican Party. But to me, again, as I mentioned, it's so important to have a good, safe workplace for our state employees, many of whom do such hard work for not the pay that they deserve, particularly our legislative aides. They do not get paid nearly enough, especially with the rising cost of living and, you know, the cost of housing and transportation and utilities and all of these things. So they tend to be in these jobs for the right reason. Like I said, trying to serve the community, just trying to get their start in their career. And we absolutely must protect them. So I read those allegations that you mentioned about the intern and the legislative aide for Representative Basabe raising the concerns of sexual harassment. And so if those concerns were raised to that law firm and then that law firm shared that with the Speaker's office, this is a huge problem and we need to know really what happened.
We'll be right back. Thanks for taking the time to watch. You can reach me at jdefede@cbs.com and follow me on Twitter @DeFede. We'll be back again next week. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day.